Clara dug her fingernails into the rotten barn door as thunder rolled behind her, the storm chasing her, like the humiliation she'd fled. She had walked miles after being thrown out of town, the sting of Henry Donnell's accusation still burning as vividly as the hunger twisting her stomach. She stepped inside the abandoned Miller barn seeking shelter, boots slipping on warped planks until one board snapped beneath her weight, revealing the corner of a wooden box wrapped in old canvas, hidden deep under the floor. She dragged the box toward a sliver of lantern light spilling through a broken wall, the canvas peeling away like fragile skin. A strange weight pressed against her ribs as she brushed off dust and found an envelope bearing her last name, Whitmore, something no one in this county ever tied to anything but disgrace. She reached for it with trembling hands, but a faint cowbell chimed outside, carried by the wind, or by someone moving with purpose toward the barn. Her body locked, breath held, pulse racing cold and fast. Clara slipped into the shadows, clutching the envelope to her chest, listening to the slow, heavy footsteps outside, too deliberate to be a stray animal. She recognized that cadence. Henry Donnell walked like that, the same man who humiliated her hours earlier. The barn door groaned open as his silhouette filled the entrance, scanning the darkness with predatory intent. Clara's eyes darted to the loft ladder. If she moved fast enough, she might escape before he spotted her. She tightened her grip on the envelope, braced herself and sprinted as her footsteps erupted through the stillness. Clara's boots pounded against the ladder rungs as she climbed, splinters biting into her palms with each frantic pull upward. Rain drummed harder on the roof, masking the noise she made, but Henry's sharp inhale below told her he'd heard something. She hauled herself into the loft, lungs burning, and crawled behind a stack of rotted hay bales, gripping the envelope so tightly the paper creased under her fingers. Her heartbeat thudded loud enough she feared it would give her away. Below her, Henry stepped deeper into the barn, his boots sinking into wet earth with steady purpose. He paused near the loose floorboard she'd uncovered, kneeling beside the gap as if sensing the secret buried there. His hand brushed the newly shifted plank, and he muttered a curse under his breath. Clara pressed her back against the rough loft wall, feeling it shake as thunder cracked overhead. If he found the box missing, he'd know someone was here, someone who wasn't supposed to learn what lay hidden. Henry straightened, gaze narrowing as he scanned the loft's shadowed beam. Clara held still, barely breathing. His hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, a familiar threat in a county where justice bent toward the wealthy. For a moment, he seemed ready to climb after her. Then a distant whistle cut through the storm, the night train approaching the bridge, drawing his attention. With a final sweeping look, Henry grunted and stepped back toward the door. Clara remained frozen, waiting, hoping, until the wind swallowed the sound of his footsteps, and silence dared her to move again. Clara waited several minutes longer, counting each breath as the storm softened and the train's whistle faded into the dark. Only when the barn settled back into stillness did she crawl forward, peering over the loft edge to confirm Henry was truly gone. The loose floorboard remained exposed below, the wooden box still missing from its hiding place, proof she had outrun danger by seconds. Her muscles trembled from adrenaline, but she forced herself to climb down quietly, boots landing on the dirt with a muted thud. She knelt beside the gap again, lantern light flickering through cracks in the walls, and brushed her fingertips over the empty space where the box had lain. Someone had meant to hide it forever, yet it had been waiting for her. Her name, scrawled on the envelope like a whispered warning from the past. Clara swallowed hard, the taste of fear and curiosity mixing as she unsealed the flap. Inside, she found a brittle deed paper, ink blurred at the edges, stamped with a date that tightened her chest, 1921. Below it, her grandfather's signature marked land she never knew existed. Before she could study the document further, a gust burst through the barn's open slats, lifting loose hay into spirals around her. Clara clutched the papers, shielding them against her dress, realizing the storm would ruin everything if she lingered. She needed shelter, real shelter, somewhere dry enough to read, somewhere Henry wouldn't follow immediately. Hugging the deed and the envelope tight against her ribs, she stepped toward the barn door, heart firming with a sudden, reckless conviction. Whatever this inheritance meant, she would uncover the truth, even if the whole county stood against her. Clara pushed through the barn doors and stepped into the muddy yard, the storm easing into a steady drizzle that blurred the horizon. Her dress clung to her legs as she crossed the clearing, the envelope tucked beneath her arm like something alive and breakable. The road ahead was empty, stretching toward town in one direction and into a tangle of woods in the other. She knew Henry patrolled the main route at night. If she risked the road, she would walk straight into his hands. The woods, though dark and slick with rain, offered a chance at silence. She chose the trees, slipping between pines that dripped water like melting glass. Branches scraped her sleeves, and the forest floor squelched beneath her boots, but each step carried her farther from the barn and closer to safety. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting Henry to emerge from the darkness with that hard, unforgiving stare. The deed weighed heavily against her chest, not just in paper, but in questions. Why had her grandfather kept this land hidden, and why had it been buried beneath Miller property instead of her own family's? The woods thinned at last, revealing a dim light flickering from the windows of an old tenant shack long abandoned after the drought years. Clara approached cautiously, testing the warped porch before stepping inside. The smell of damp timber filled her lungs as she set the deed on a crooked table and unrolled it fully beneath the lantern glow. Names, dates, and a faintly embossed seal told a story she barely understood. And there, scrawled in shaky handwriting along the margin, a message she hadn't noticed before. If she ever comes looking, tell her the fire wasn't an accident. The shack's walls creaked with wind as Clara stared, pulse rising. Someone had known she would find this one day. Clara steadied the lantern with one hand as the message on the deed blurred and sharpened beneath her trembling gaze. The fire. Everyone in the county spoke of it as a tragic accident that wiped out the Miller family a decade earlier, but the scrawl on the margin hinted at something far darker. She traced the shaky handwriting, recognizing neither the penmanship nor the tone. Urgent, as though written by someone expecting to be silenced. Her breath quickened, each inhale scraping like gravel as the weight of the truth pressed against her ribs. She folded the deed carefully and tucked it back into the envelope, pushing aside a trembling panic. If someone had expected her to come looking, then they had. Known she would be cast out, pushed into desperation, driven toward the very secrets the town buried. Clara paced the narrow shack, boots leaving wet prints on the warped floorboards. The message wasn't a clue. It was a warning, one meant for the descendant of a family that had lost everything. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that another set of eyes had watched that barn for years, waiting to see who would uncover what lay beneath. A sudden crack outside snapped her attention toward the door. Branch or footstep, she couldn't tell. The lantern flickered as the wind pressed against the thin walls, carrying with it a sound too heavy to be the weather. Slow, deliberate movement circling the shack. Clara extinguished the lantern with shaking fingers, plunging the room into darkness. She clutched the envelope tight and backed away from the window. Whoever had written that message had feared being found. Now, standing alone in the pitch black, Clara understood why. Because someone was out there, and they were looking for her. Clara held her breath as the footsteps outside shifted, slow and deliberate, circling the shack like a predator testing the strength of a trap. Rain whispered against the roof, masking small sounds, but not enough to drown the unmistakable crunch of boots sinking into wet soil. She pressed herself against the corner, envelope clutched to her chest, listening for any clue that might reveal whether she faced Henry or someone far quieter, and possibly more dangerous. A shadow passed across the window, brief but unmistakable. Someone knew she was here. The doorknob jiggled once, metal scraping metal, and Clara felt her throat tighten. Whoever was outside wasn't just passing through. They were searching for entry. She scanned the room in the faint moonlight spilling through cracks in the walls, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers brushed a rusted pitchfork lying in the corner, long abandoned by the tenant who once lived here. Its weight steadied her trembling hands as she lifted it, teeth clenched. If Henry wanted to drag her back to town in disgrace, he would have to fight for it. But deep down, she sensed this intruder moved with a different intention, one less loud, more calculated, like someone used to approaching without witnesses. The sound stopped abruptly. Silence settled heavy enough to make her ears ring. Clara strained to hear, but nothing beyond the rain answered. Then a knock, soft, deliberate, tapped twice against the door. Not Henry's style, not aggressive, not mocking. A voice followed, low and worn with age. "Clara Whitmore. Child, if that's you, I need to speak with you before he finds you." The pitchfork slipped slightly in her grip as her heart lurched. She recognized that voice from whispered stories, from warnings spoken over supper long ago. Martha Miller, the only surviving member of the family lost in the fire, had found her first. Clara hesitated only a moment before sliding the door open just enough to reveal the frail outline of Martha Miller, hunched beneath a soaked shawl. The woman's eyes, cloudy with age yet painfully alert, darted past Clara into the shadows of the shack. "He's on your trail," Martha whispered, gripping Clara's arm with surprising strength. "If he catches you with that deed, he'll bury the truth all over again." Clara's pulse hammered as she pulled the old woman inside, fastening the door behind them. The room felt smaller now, charged with secrets pressing at its walls. Martha sank onto a wooden crate, breath wheezing softly, rainwater dripping from the ends of her shawl. "I saw Henry's lantern down the ridge," she said. "He knows someone dug up the box. He's done this dance before, looking for anyone desperate enough to find what his daddy hid." The name struck Clara cold. Henry's father, Raymond Donnell, had been sheriff during the fire, known for turning truth into whatever suited his interests. Martha's gaze sharpened as it fell on the envelope in Clara's hands. "That's your people's land," she murmured. "Should have been yours long before the fire." Clara knelt beside her, unfolding the deed again under what little moonlight filtered through the boards. "Why did my grandfather hide it here? Why the Millers?" Martha swallowed hard, grief knotting her throat. "Because the night your grandfather signed that deed, he witnessed what Raymond planned. And when the fire came, he feared the Donnells would pin everything on him next. He asked my family to protect the papers until the right Whitmore came looking." Martha reached for Clara's trembling hand. "But child, once you know the whole of it, there's no turning back, and Henry won't let you walk away with the truth." Clara steadied herself as Martha's words settled like stones in her chest, the storm outside dimming to a distant rumble. She crouched beside the crate, studying the deed again, noticing faint smudges she had overlooked, fingerprints pressed into the margin, as if someone had folded it hastily while running. "There's more, isn't there?" Clara asked, voice tight. Martha nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging under memories that had lived too long in silence. "The fire wasn't meant for us," she whispered. "It was meant for your grandfather. We were only in the way." The admission sent a cold shiver down Clara's spine. She clutched the envelope tighter, feeling the edges bite into her palm. "Raymond set the fire," Martha continued, each word trembling. "He wanted the land your grandfather had bought. The rail company paid handsomely for access, and Raymond aimed to claim it first. When your grandfather wouldn't sell, the sheriff decided to remove the problem altogether, but he targeted the wrong house." Clara's breath caught. The story she had been raised with, a tragic accident, fractured under the weight of Martha's truth. "Why didn't anyone speak up?" she demanded. Martha's eyes glistened. "Because Raymond held the law in his fist. Anyone who questioned it disappeared." Clara rose to her feet, pacing the narrow room as panic tangled with fury. She had spent her life believing poverty and shame were her inheritance, not violence committed in her family's shadow. "Henry knows I have the deed," she murmured. "If he finds us, he'll destroy it just like his father tried to destroy everything connected to the truth." Martha struggled to stand, gripping Clara's arm again. "Then we can't stay here. There's something else your grandfather left. Something that proves what happened the night of the fire. If Henry reaches it first, the truth dies with us." The old woman's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "We must go to the Miller ruins before dawn." Clara pushed open the shack door and let the cool, damp air rush in, the storm fading into a low growl across the treetops. Martha leaned heavily on her arm as they stepped outside, the forest dark, but no longer silent. Twigs snapped in the distance, and the hush of disturbed leaves followed them like a warning. Clara forced herself to move quickly, guiding Martha along the narrow trail that wound between pines, dripping with the last remnants of rain. Every sound seemed sharper now, every shadow too still, as though the forest itself knew they were being hunted. They kept to the trees, avoiding the open paths where lantern light could give them away. The soil was soft beneath their boots, swallowing noise, but it also held clear tracks Henry could follow. Clara tried to steady the breath rattling in her chest, her fingers brushing the envelope tucked close to her ribs. Inside lay the deed, the only proof her family had once possessed something worth killing for. "The ruins are 1/2 mile east," Martha whispered, her voice cracking. "Your grandfather hid the rest there before Raymond came after him." Clara swallowed hard, picturing the charred remains she'd passed by countless times as a child, never knowing they held the truth. A sudden beam of light swept across the trees behind them, thin but unmistakable. Lantern, close. Martha clutched Clara's sleeve, fear etched deep in her frail features. "He's cutting off the road," she rasped. "He knows where we're headed." Clara's pulse surged, legs burning as she pulled Martha forward. The ruins, once a distant dread, now felt like their only hope. Branches whipped at Clara's arms as she ran, dragging Martha through the shadows, and as the lantern's glow grew brighter behind them, Clara realized Henry wasn't tracking them. He was flushing them out, herding them toward the very place where the truth first burned. Clara burst from the tree line, just as the ruins of the Miller homestead emerged from the darkness, the skeletal remains of the farmhouse rising like a warning from the earth. Charred beams jutted upward, blackened by a decade of rain and sun, and the foundations lay cracked and overgrown with vines. Martha stumbled beside her, breath coming in shallow gasps, but determination sharpened her features as she pointed toward the collapsed cellar entrance. "There," she rasped. "That's where your grandfather hid the last piece. Raymond never found it." Clara tightened her grip on the envelope, feeling the thud of her pulse against the paper. They pushed through tangled brush until they reached the cellar, its entrance half swallowed by earth. Clara knelt and clawed at the damp soil with trembling hands, lifting broken boards one by one. Beneath the rubble, something glinted faintly under the moonlight, a metal hinge rusted but intact. She pulled harder and uncovered a small iron box wedged between crumbling stones. The weight of it felt wrong in her hands, heavier than its size should allow, humming with the kind of truth that destroys reputations and buries families. Martha leaned close, her voice barely a whisper. "Your grandfather stored photographs, records, names, proof that Raymond lit the fire himself." Before Clara could open the box, the sharp crack of a branch split the night. She jerked her head up to see a lantern glow sliding between the trees, steady and unhurried. Henry was closing in. Martha clutched Clara's arm, desperation trembling through her frail body. "Child, listen to me," she breathed. "What's inside that box will change everything, but once you look, there's no hiding from the Donnells again." Clara stared at the iron box, her fingers pressed against the cold latch. The truth of her family's past sat in her, hands waiting, and behind them, Henry's lantern burned brighter, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Clara wrestled the latch free, just as the lantern glow grew brighter behind the trees, her breath fogging in the cold night air. The iron box creaked open with a reluctant groan, its hinges stiff from years beneath earth and ash. Inside lay a stack of charred photographs, edges warped by heat, yet still revealing faces. Workers gathered near the mill, her grandfather beside them, and a shadowed figure pouring something from a tin can near the barn. Clara's stomach twisted as she lifted the next photo, clearer than the rest. It showed Raymond Donnell in the act of striking a match, a smear of kerosene staining his boots. Proof. Real, undeniable proof. Beneath the photographs, Clara found a folded ledger page, brittle and ink-stained, bearing her grandfather's handwriting. It listed the names of witness workers threatened into silence, sums of money paid by Raymond, and a final line that chilled her blood. "If anything happens to me, the Whitmore land goes to Clara. Do not trust the sheriff." She closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the realization that her grandfather had died expecting she'd one day need this truth to survive. Martha reached trembling fingers toward the ledger, grief clouding her gaze. "He tried to protect us all," she whispered, "but Raymond made sure his lies were the only ones the county heard." A twig snapped behind them, louder this time, close enough that Clara felt the vibration in her spine. Henry's lantern flared at the edge of the clearing, casting his shadow long across the ruin. Martha stiffened, clutching Clara's arm. "You must choose now," the old woman rasped. "Run with the truth or stay and confront the man who carries his father's sins." Clara gathered the ledger and photographs, shoving them into the envelope with frantic urgency. The papers crackled against her heartbeat as she rose. The truth she held could free her family, or destroy her if Henry reached her first. Clara backed toward the remnants of the cellar wall, the envelope pressed to her chest as Henry stepped fully into the clearing. His lantern swung at his side, throwing jagged shadows across the charred beams behind him. He didn't rush, didn't shout. His calmness was far more terrifying. "You should have stayed quiet, Clara," he said, voice low and steady, as if scolding a disobedient child. Your kind gets hurt when you dig where you don't belong. Martha stepped forward despite her trembling, placing herself between Clara and Henry, with a resolve that surprised them both. Your father murdered my family, she rasped, and you've spent your life guarding his lies. Henry inhaled sharply, jaw tightening before a cold smile crept across his lips. Stories burn easy, Martha. Same as houses. He took another step, boots crunching through broken brick. Clara's grip tightened on the envelope until her knuckles whitened. The truth inside it could topple. The Donnell name. But only if she lived long enough to reach someone who would listen. She scanned the ruins, calculating distance and cover. The old well lay behind Henry, too far to reach. The woods lay behind her, dark but navigable. Martha squeezed her arm subtly, urging her to choose. He won't let us leave, she whispered. So you must decide which life you're willing to risk, yours or his legacy. Clara's breath shuddered as the weight of the choice cracked through her resolve. Running would buy her a chance at survival, but condemn Martha to face Henry alone. Staying meant confronting a man raised on violence and privilege, backed by a county that bent to his name. Henry drew his pistol slowly, almost lazily, as if certain of the outcome. "Hand me that envelope," he said, "and we can all forget this ever happened." Clara stared at the gun, then at Martha's frail frame, and felt something in her chest harden. She stepped sideways, lifting the photos so the lantern light hit. Raymond Donnell's incriminating image. Henry's expression flickered, rage, fear, recognition, before twisting into something far more dangerous. Henry's face twisted as the photograph caught the lantern's glow, the image of his father mid-stride in the act of lighting the match that doomed the Miller home. For a heartbeat, the night held still. Then Henry lunged, fueled by panic rather than rage, his pistol hand trembling as he closed the distance. Clara stumbled back, clutching the envelope. Against her ribs, the truth burning through her like a spark waiting for air. Martha cried out, her frail voice sharp, but Henry silenced her with a vicious glare. "You don't know what you're looking at," he snarled, though fear cracked through the words. Clara steadied her breath, raising the photograph higher to force him to look again. "Your father killed those people," she said, voice raw but unbroken. "He tried to kill mine too, and you've spent your life protecting a murderer." Henry's boots slid on wet ash as he advanced, the pistol lifting in a shaking grip. "You think anyone will believe you?" he shot back. "When the sheriff finds you trespassing with stolen papers? When half the county owes my family a debt? You're nobody, Clara. Dirt under their boots." She felt the sting of those words, the same ones the town had thrown at her for years, but something inside her resisted the place he tried to send her. Martha pushed herself between them again, gripping Henry's coat with the strength of desperation. "Raymond didn't just kill my family," she rasped. "He killed yours too, piece by piece. He stole their land, their names, their futures." Henry shoved her aside, but the old woman held on, tugging him off balance long enough for Clara to act. She stepped onto a fallen beam, raising herself above him, and thrust the ledger page into the lantern light, a page that spelled his father's guilt in ink and witness signatures. Henry froze, his breath breaking in shallow bursts. Clara saw it then, the truth landing on him like a blow, and in that fragile second the full weight of what she held became undeniable. Henry's hesitation lasted only a breath, but it was long enough for Clara to see the truth fracture behind his eyes. The certainty he had worn his entire life, built on his father's lies, shuddered like a rotting beam about to collapse. But fear made him dangerous, and he surged forward again, snatching for the ledger with trembling fury. Clara twisted. Away, boots skidding across the slick foundation as rain tapped against the broken stone around them. Martha scrambled to her feet, coughing hard, her hands reaching out to pull Clara back from the edge of the ruins. Clara's pulse hammered as Henry leveled the pistol at her chest, the lantern's glow shaking with the tremor in his hand. "Give it to me," he ordered, voice cracking under the strain. "You don't understand what happens if this gets out. My family built this county. Everything falls apart if you take this away." Clara met his gaze and saw not strength but terror. Terror of a world where his name no longer shielded him from consequence. "Your father built nothing," she said softly. "He stole. He burned. He buried the living and the dead. And you've been helping him hide it." Henry flinched as if struck, the gun wavering just an inch, but enough for Clara to breathe again. The moment teetered on a blade. One step, one mistake, and the truth would die with her here among the ashes. Martha clutched Clara's arm, whispering, "Child, don't let him decide your fate." Clara felt her resolve solidify, anchoring her despite the trembling in her limbs. She held the envelope higher, letting the lantern illuminate every damning mark on the photographs and ledger. The wind gusted through the ruins, sending sparks of cold rain across Henry's face as he whispered, "You can't win this." Clara steadied her breath, the decision finally forming with sharp clarity. "I don't have to win," she said. "I just have to tell the truth." Henry lunged before Clara could take another breath, his desperation breaking free like a dam finally giving way. She stumbled backward as he grabbed at the envelope, fingers clawing for the truth she held, the pistol knocking against her arm with a jolt that sent pain shooting to her shoulder. Martha cried out, trying to pull Henry away, but he shoved her aside with far more force than her frail body could bear. Clara caught her as she fell, steadying her just enough to keep the old woman upright before turning to face Henry again. They circled the ruins, the broken foundation forming a jagged ring around them. Henry's lantern swung wildly, throwing fractured shadows that made the ground seem alive. Clara dodged another grab, but the slick stones betrayed her footing, and she went down hard on one knee. The envelope nearly slipped from her grasp. Henry towered over her, breath ragged, pistol glinting in the unsteady light. "You think a few scraps of paper change anything?" he spat. "You think the sheriff will take your word over mine?" Clara lifted her chin despite the pain. "I don't need the sheriff," she said. "I just need a crowd." Henry froze, confusion cutting through his fury. That was the moment Clara drove her shoulder into his leg, knocking him off balance. He staggered backward, arms pinwheeling, and the lantern slipped from his grip, shattering on the stones. Fire flared across the spilled oil, small but hungry, casting the ruins in violent orange light. Henry cursed, scrambling away from the flames, and Clara rose with the envelope pressed to her chest. The firelight illuminated his face, fear, anger, and the realization that control was slipping from his hands. Martha's voice rang out over the crackling flames, thin but steady. "The town will hear this, Henry Donnell. Every last word." The flames crawled across the ruined foundation, throwing wild ribbons of light that made the night twist and tremble. Henry scrambled backward, shielding his face as sparks leapt toward him, his confidence unraveling under the heat. Clara stepped away from the growing fire, pulling Martha with her, the envelope pressed tight against her ribs as though it were part of her heartbeat. "This ends tonight," Clara murmured, more to herself than to Henry, the truth burning hotter than the flames between them. Henry coughed through the smoke, rising to his feet with a snarl, the pistol still clenched in his. Shaking fist. "You're not walking into town with that," he said, voice cracking under fear he could no longer mask. But Clara saw it for what it was, not power, but panic. The firelight illuminated every lie he'd inherited, every shadow he clung to. "Your father chose the flames," Clara said steadily, "and you've been carrying the torch ever since." Henry's grip tightened, but his aim wavered. Smoke stung his eyes. Doubt stung his resolve. For the first time, Clara saw a man realizing his world was smaller than the truth he'd tried to bury. Martha pulled Clara a few steps farther from the blaze, her voice low but urgent. "Child, the dawn isn't far. If we reach the square before he does, the sheriff will have no choice but to listen." Clara nodded, determination solidifying even as her lungs ached from the smoke. She turned back toward Henry, meeting his furious, unraveling gaze. "You can chase us," she said softly, "or you can face what's already burning behind you." Henry's eyes flickered to the widening fire, the ruins glowing like the past resurrected. Clara didn't wait for his choice. She tightened her grip on the envelope and stepped into the dark, guiding Martha toward the path that would lead them to the town, toward truth, danger, and whatever waited beyond the flames. Clara and Martha moved swiftly through the dark woods, guided by the faint promise of dawn blooming behind the hills. The fire at the ruins cast a distant orange glow through the branches, a warning. Flare Henry could not ignore for long. Clara felt the envelope thump against her chest with each hurried step, its edges damp with sweat and fog. The truth inside it weighed heavier than anything she had ever carried, but it pushed her forward with purpose. Martha leaned on her with every stride, her breaths thin but determined. The trees thinned as they reached the narrow road leading to town, its dirt slick from the night's rain. Clara paused, scanning the horizon for lantern light or the sound of hooves, but the world lay quiet except for the soft chirp of waking crickets. "We have to reach the square before Henry finds another way around," Martha murmured, pulling her shawl closer against the cold. Clara nodded, gripping the envelope tighter. She pictured the town gathering near the well at first light, farmers and merchants preparing for the day. If she reached them there, Henry couldn't silence her without witnesses, but as they stepped onto the road, a low rumble rose behind them, hoofbeats, steady and growing. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. She pulled Martha into the brush just as a horse emerged around the bend, Henry riding hard, his silhouette rigid with fury. He scanned the path ahead, lanterns swinging at his side, unaware of how close he had passed them. Clara waited until the sound faded into the distance, then exhaled shakily. "We're taking the long route," she whispered, guiding Martha through the fields toward town. The sun's first pale light touched the horizon, signaling the final stretch. The truth would find daylight soon, for better or worse. Clara and Martha emerged from the fields as the first true light of morning spilled across the valley, the edges of town beginning to stir awake. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, dogs barked in distant yards, and the soft creak of wagon wheels drifted from the main road. Clara's legs burned with exhaustion, but the sight of the square ahead renewed her strength. The well stood at its center, surrounded by benches and a bulletin board where half the county gathered at dawn. If she reached it now, the truth would have an audience. They crossed the final stretch of grass when a sharp shout split the air. Clara spun around to see Henry galloping down the road from the south, his horse kicking mud in frantic bursts. He must have circled back when he lost their trail, rage driving him faster than fear. Townsfolk turned at the commotion, stepping out of storefronts and porches, their faces widening with curiosity. Clara tightened her hold on the envelope, feeling its stiff corners bite into her palm. This was the crowd she needed, but Henry intended to reach them first. Clara stepped onto the well's stone edge, lifting the ledger page high so the morning sun caught its ink. "Henry Donnell's father set the mill afire," she shouted, voice cracking but loud enough to carry. Murmurs rippled instantly through the gathering crowd. Henry's horse skidded to a stop, nearly throwing him as he leapt down, fury contorting his face. "Lies!" he roared, reaching for Clara's arm. But this time he wasn't in the shadows. He was surrounded by witnesses. Clara jerked away, thrusting the photo of Raymond lighting the match into the air. Gasps followed, like a wave through the square. Henry froze, his hand still outstretched, realization dawning too late. The truth had found daylight. For a long moment, the square remained frozen, the early light catching every shocked face as if the town itself held its breath. Clara lowered the photograph slowly, letting the murmurs build, watching disbelief ripple through neighbors who had lived under the Donnell name for decades. Henry stood rigid, jaw clenched, fury trembling through him like a trapped storm. He lunged toward Clara again, but two men from the feed store stepped between them, blocking his advance. "Easy, Henry," one warned. "You ain't laying hands on her here." Henry's gaze darted wildly from Clara to the growing crowd. "She forged it," he shouted, voice cracking. "This is Whitmore lies, same as her grandfather." But Clara pulled the ledger page into view, the faded witness signatures visible even from a distance. "These men were threatened into silence," she called out. "Your father paid them, Sheriff Donnell." Gasps rippled again, sharper this time. Clara spotted the sheriff himself pushing through the crowd, face pale, eyes darting across the documents. He reached for the ledger with a trembling hand, scanning the names he recognized all too well. Martha stepped forward, her voice thin but unwavering. "Your father murdered my family," she told him, "and you knew pieces of it. You looked the other way." The sheriff swallowed, guilt rising to the surface as whispers surged around them. Henry lunged one last time, but the sheriff caught his arm, twisting it behind his back with a practiced grip. "Enough," he growled. "You've done plenty." As Henry struggled, Clara felt the envelope lighten in her hands. Not because the truth grew smaller, but because it finally belonged to daylight, no longer trapped in ruins and shadows. And for the first time since stepping into that abandoned barn, she felt the weight of justice shift. The sheriff hauled Henry toward the jailhouse as the town murmured around them, their disbelief turning into something heavier, recognition. Clara stepped down from the well's stone edge, her legs shaking now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. Martha leaned against her, frail, but standing tall, her eyes shining not with triumph, but with long-delayed relief. The early sun washed over the square, illuminating the photographs and ledger Clara still clutched. No one tried to take them from her. Instead, townsfolk gathered closer, reading the proof with widening eyes. The past had spoken at last, A few women guided Martha to a bench, offering blankets and water as Clara knelt beside her. "You did what none of us could," Martha whispered, her fingers tightening around Clara's hand. "Your grandfather believed the truth would find you, and it did." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything she had carried since stepping into that abandoned barn. The deed, the secrets, the fear, they had led her here, to a moment where silence no longer protected the powerful. The sheriff approached again, hat in hand, shame etched deep into the lines of his face. "Miss Whitmore, you'll want to take these papers to the judge. Land this old belongs with the rightful family." It was the closest thing to an apology he could give. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara looked toward the horizon where the ruins still smoldered faintly in the distance. The fire that once destroyed lives had sparked a new beginning, one she never expected. With the deed secured and the truth finally free, she realized she now held a future her family had been denied for years. "Come on, child," Martha murmured, rising with help from the women beside her. "We've got land to reclaim." Clara exhaled, steady and sure, stepping forward into the morning with the envelope under her arm, her inheritance no longer hidden, but claimed in full view of the world.